Okay, we're going to begin our presentation. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Interaction of Processes and its Importance to a Successful Audit webinar. My name is Joseph Krolikowski, and I'm the Technical Director of Perry Johnson Registrars. A couple of technical notes for everybody. All of our participants are on mute, but we absolutely want to answer your questions, so please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. One common question that we get is regards to copies of this presentation. They will be available for download shortly after we're finished. And this webinar and all other past PJR webinars will be available for reviewing on our website under previously recorded webinars. Our topics for today, we're going to have some background on the requirements that relate to interaction of processes. We're going to address that from both the ISO 9001-2008 and also the ISO 9001-2015 standards. We're going to explore how a process is defined officially, and we're also going to explore what is not a process. And finally, we will have some strategies for you to meet the requirement with minimal changes to your existing documentation if you have some concerns that your current interaction of processes may not be fully effective. Back in 2014, Perry Johnson Registrars was faced with a mandate from our accreditation bodies. We were told that we had to start taking a harder line in our assessment of client interaction of process, or IOP, documents. Now, one of the requirements that was brought to bear as justification for this was ISO 17021, which was at its 2011 revision at that time, and it has since been updated in 2015. That standard, that's the standard that PJR is certified to. It includes a clause, and it reads in part, "An audit program for the full certification cycle shall be developed to clearly identify the audit activity or activities required to demonstrate that the client's management system fulfills the requirements for certification." In other words, we are expected to ensure that our auditors perform and document their audits in such a way that they reflect the client's management system. Now, where that gets difficult is where we have an interaction of process document that does not do an effective job of identifying the process or processes. It's our policy to adhere to that interaction of process document, and only to the interaction of process document. That is viewed by the industry as the official representation of this is what the processes are for this organization, and we have to build our audit report and audit plan and all of the other working pieces of the audit around that IOP. So if we have an IOP that does not do an effective job, we are at a significant disadvantage in terms of fulfilling that audit program management requirement. So we instructed our auditors back in 2014 to issue nonconformances to clients that have an IOP that does not identify processes in an appropriate manner. Let's take a look at where the requirement for processes, where those requirements are spelled out. We'll start with ISO 9001-2008. There are three primary clauses at play. In 4.1a, it states that the organization shall determine the processes that are needed for the quality management system and their application throughout the organization. In 4.1b, it states the organization shall determine the sequence and interaction of these processes. And in 4.2.2c, it states that the organization shall establish and maintain a quality manual that includes a description of the interaction between the processes of the quality management system. Now in ISO 9001-2015, at least in the first two places, the requirements are almost exactly the same. All of these come from section 4.4. In 4.4.1, it states that the organization shall determine the processes needed for the quality management system. In 4.4.1b, it states that the organization shall determine the sequence and interaction of these processes. And then in 4.4.2, it states the organization shall maintain documented information to support the operation of its processes. And it's from that clause that we continue to require that there be some representation of what your processes are and how they interact with each other. So what is a process? How is process defined? There is an official definition that is given in the ISO 9000 document. That is the Fundamentals and Vocabulary Standard, where it states that a process is a set of interrelated or interacting activities that use inputs to deliver an intended result. Now the key portion of that definition is interrelated or interacting activities. This helps us understand a key aspect of what a process is not. It is not a single step. It is a series of activities that are focused on a shared goal. Now in terms of common examples of process designations, here are some of the more common examples that we see. We see sales, we see purchasing, we see production, shipping, design and development. These are very common process designations. However, the IOP, the interaction of processes, has to reflect what you believe your processes to be. If your understanding is that your quality management system is made up of 4 basic processes, for example, sales, purchasing, production, support, it is completely acceptable for your IOP to reflect as much. Now in terms of what is not a process, there are a few things that raise concerns for us in terms of not fulfilling this requirement effectively. The IOP documents that get rejected most often are the ones that present steps within a single process. For example, if we have a production flow that starts with receipt of raw materials, walks through every step of the manufacturing process, and ends with shipment of product, and says nothing about the administrative activities, nothing about the support activities, that's going to be problematic. That's going to potentially be rejected and be cause for a nonconformance. We've given an example here. If we have steps like create work order, issue production schedule, complete work order, package product, ship product, it's conceivable that these items are part of a single process, but they are very likely not standalone processes by themselves. Another item that would come up as problematic would be an interaction of process document that presents sections from the standard as the organization's processes. You know, these IOP documents where, for example, there is a process called resource management. That's a section in the ISO 9001 standard. That's questionable that that is what your process is. That is a section from the ISO 9001 standard. Any interaction of process document that bears these types of things as processes will likely result in a nonconformance being issued. So what do we do about this? For a lot of our clients, we recognize that a lot of careful thought and consideration went into the development of your IOP. And we're also well aware that it is a little jarring, a little disconcerting to be told that something that was accepted for many years is now suddenly unacceptable. So what we wanted to do was explore a possible approach on tweaking an existing IOP to meet the requirements in a more effective way. We're going to take a sample of an interaction of processes and improve it in two key ways. We're going to begin with a review of the raw interaction of process document. Now, please note this is not an example from any particular PGR client. This IOP was created solely for the purpose of this presentation. Okay, here is our raw IOP. Now you will note that there are 12 boxes on here. Boxes typically indicate a process, and 2 decision diamonds. And do we take from this that there are 12 distinct processes? I suppose that's possible, but let's look at what some of these steps are. Sales and work orders issued towards the middle there on the top. Is that a standalone process? Issue a purchase order to a supplier. Is that a standalone process? Order entered into mainframe system. Is that truly a standalone process? And furthermore, are these all of the processes of the quality management system? Are these all of the things that make up what this organization does? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to identify the support processes. Some of the IOP documents that get rejected, they lack a specific place to identify the support activities. Now, on the matter of calling them support processes, it's important for you to note that neither ISO 9000 nor 9001, neither of them draw any particular distinction between the classification of processes. However, this concept of key and core processes is very common. So what do we mean by support processes? Well, a number of things, but a few examples would include the following: management review, internal auditing, training, corrective action. So how do we fit this into our interaction of process document? Well, let's see how we can do that. Okay, we've now added a box in the lower right-hand corner, and as you can see, this particular box is not connected to any of the others, but it has 3 arrows that are intended to identify that these support processes are support for all of the quality management system. They provide support to the entire quality management system. Now, the second improvement that we're going to attempt here is the creation of an IOP key. And this has actually been a very popular strategy for our clients, where there is a desire to retain the IOP that they originally created, and to use the key as a way of reflecting what the processes are. Now, there's a number of ways that this can be done. You can use numbers, you can use alpha characters. For purposes of our demonstration today, we're going to use colors. And again, this enables your IOP to stay as is, but it serves the quality system and the audit process by naming the processes that are made up by the various process steps. So let's apply that improvement now. Okay, so we have the same IOP that we started with, but we've now applied some color to it. And we can see in the lower left-hand portion that we have 6 distinct processes. We have sales order entry in orange, we have purchasing in green, production in yellow, shipping in purple, which happens to be a single step on this IOP, quality is considered a separate process and is identified in red, and finally support in blue. And now we've really got something. By these two small adjustments, we've kept the content of the IOP just as it was before, but we've accomplished two key things. We now know what the company's processes are, and we have an appropriate reflection of the complete quality management system, including support processes. This is an IOP that will absolutely pass audit assessment. Now, obviously, there's a number of ways to create an interaction of process document. There's a number of methodologies that you can use, and we wanted to share with you some additional examples so that you may have some further ideas on how to go about doing this. Now, each of these examples is from an existing or former PJR client. All gave permission for their IOPs to be used in this presentation. Here's our first example. This is a kind of a top-down flow showing the core activities in the middle, contracts, purchasing, engineering, scheduling, production, quality, and shipping. And then again, you'll note that support is a rather large block off to the side. And again, the idea is that this is providing support to the entirety of the quality management system. Here is another slightly busier example. This particular one I've included in the presentation because I want you to see how unique the process names are, particularly in the middle, where we have quote as a process, work order receiving inspection as a process, overhaul as a process, inventory management and shipping, with quality and management related, again on the outside, lending support to the entirety of the quality system. So again, it's important to remember that these are your processes. These are not supposed to be the sections of the standard. These are not supposed to be what your consultant tells you your processes are. These are your processes and to be reflected on your IOP. Here's another example. This particular model is commonly referred to as the Swimlane Approach. You'll note on the left-hand side there are actually 4 processes that are represented here. Sales process, purchasing process, production process, and support processes. And the idea here is that sales and purchasing begin sort of independent from each other. Sales is triggered by orders from customers. Purchasing is triggered by reviews of available inventory. They kind of meet in the middle, so to speak, with the receipt of purchased items, triggering the issuance of work orders, which in turn, both of those items trigger the production process. And then again, we have support on the bottom, providing overall support to the processes at large. This particular IOP has been presented for a couple of key reasons. Number one, this particular company wanted to have a set of broken out support processes. So rather than a single block of support processes, they kind of ringed them around on the periphery here and used highlighting as a means to identify what their core processes are. And again, you'll note the unique names that have been applied. You have service exchange, repair and return, distribution. These are very unique process names, and they give, again, a sense that this is a very personal IOP for the company that created it. So the core processes and then anything that isn't highlighted is considered support. So we would have in total we would have 6 items here, the 5 that are highlighted and then support considered as a cumulative of the unhighlighted items. So in conclusion, we want to ensure that we are providing our clients with a value-added audit. We have to make sure, of course, that we meet all applicable requirements. We do hope that you will use the points of today's presentation to develop an even better understanding of what your processes are. I do thank you for your time. At this time, I will unlock the question panel. I'll remind all of you that the IOP presentation will be available for reviewing shortly, and the slides will be available for download shortly as well. We have a question from Jason Stevens. Can a text-based document, such as a quality manual, continue to serve as an IOP? Absolutely. Flowcharts are I suppose the common approach, perhaps even the preferred approach, if I could be so bold, but I've absolutely seen text-rooted descriptions of process interaction, and that will absolutely continue to be acceptable. Are there any other questions that I can answer today? Beverly Olson asks, can you have an IOP of only procedures? Interesting question, Beverly. We have had companies in the past that have told us that their processes are represented by the procedures that they've put together. I think that I would accept that explanation in principle. Certainly it's conceivable that an organization could have a procedure for every one of their processes. I would look at that case carefully, but in principle it seems possible that that would be an approach. Okay. Chris Sweat asks, is this applicable to the new IETF standard as well? Yes, it most assuredly is. You are still expected to have a representation of your processes and how they interact with each other. And in fact, I cannot quote the clause number off the top of my head, but you are still expected to have a quality manual in the IATF 16949 standard as well, just to share that with you. Tim Lyons asks, should all of our documentation be updated to reflect the new ISO 2015 IATF 16949 before we are technically certified? Well, it's a little bit off topic, but in terms of the expectation, remember that with your documentation, and this applies to the IOP as well, it should be reflective of what your processes are. Now, of course, ISO 9001:2015 has no required procedures, so you're not in any danger of leaving a requirement unfulfilled if you choose to forego procedures in ISO 9001:2015. There are several procedures required in IATF 16949. Look for the designations. I forget the exact verbiage, but it says to have a documented process, and that's the key trigger for that type of requirement. Okay. Wilbert Vivas asks, can the organization explain by interview the IOP instead of a flow chart? I don't believe an interview would fulfill the requirement, Wilbert, only from the standpoint that in 442 it does state that you have to maintain documented information to support the operation of processes. This is considered a core item, and therefore a verbal explanation would not suffice. Mark Mopine asks, can you combine this process of interaction into a QMS that covers ISO 9 and ISO 14001? Mark, I'm not an expert on ISO 14001, so I don't want to comment on that definitively, but I do know that there are a number of companies that have a unified system that meets both 9 and 14, and it would be my presumption that that would be something they would want to accomplish. Jeff Conklin asks, pair forms. Is there a pair form required for each key and supporting process? Not in ISO 9001. I know that pair documentation is required in the context of performing an AS 9100 audit. That's about all I know about that, but I can tell you it's not specifically required for ISO 9001. Tim Hillman asks, do we make up a new simplified IOP and keep our detail IOP behind it? Tim, that is an approach that some companies will take. They'll have a document that serves as an identification of this is what our processes are and this is how they interact, and then sometimes a page or pages of documents that goes into more detail. If that approach makes more sense to you, then most assuredly you can do that, and that would be acceptable. David Eichert asks, can you explain the difference between a procedure and a process? Certainly. A procedure is a document. It's documented, it's written out, and it explains how an activity is performed. It's a specified way to perform an activity. A process is quite simply, as we looked at earlier, it's a set of interrelated activities that transform inputs into outputs. Robert Cornell asks, I have used rings to show the outward expanding process scope. So production is in the middle, management review, corrective action, etc. in the outer ring. Robert, in principle, that sounds promising. Obviously, we would want to give it a look in the context of an audit, but if it identifies processes in an effective manner, it should be acceptable. Jennifer Reseter asks, we build product according to customer-provided drawings and specifications. Our key processes are planning and manufacturing. Is this sufficient, or do we include purchasing, corrective action, etc.? Jennifer, the representation of your processes, it's absolutely for you to designate what your processes are, but remember that your quality management system has to fulfill all of the requirements of the applicable standards. So you mentioned purchasing, for example. I'm going to presume that there's a limited amount of purchasing activity to support your system. But it is still an aspect meeting the requirements of Section 7.4 from ISO 9001-2008, for example. You still have to meet those requirements. You have to have a process that meets those requirements. Now, if your planning process is how that's accomplished, well, that's fine. But do be careful that you've not left out pieces of the quality system by making the process designations too few. Mark Mopine clarifies, meaning that one process diagram covering both standards, so therefore it may be more complex and therefore audited by the registrar during both audits. Yes, that would be the approach. And I'm not an expert in the sustainability standards, but I know that that's been done. Florence Bernard asks, is it required produced ID in the boxes? Florence, I do apologize. I'm going to have to ask that you clarify your question. I'll give it another try. If you could please clarify what you're asking. Beverly Olson asks, should you add the IOP to the quality manual? Well, interesting question. Bear in mind that a quality manual is no longer required in ISO 9001-2015. You are required to define your scope. You are required to define any clauses that don't apply to you. But in terms of where you choose to retain your representation of processes and how they interact, it does not necessarily have to be within the context of an IOP. Rob Gettle asks, are there any guidelines concerning how detailed process or IOP should be before getting down to the work instruction level? Well, Rob, again, the basic premise is we need to know what your processes are. And we need to know how they interact with each other. Now, whether you're calling out work instruction numbers and titles and so forth within the IOP itself, it's not required. Maybe it's helpful to you as an administrator of your quality system, but what we're looking for is something that tells us definitively what are the processes of this system and how do they interact. Scott Favreau asks, could an audit plan or schedule serve as our IOP? I'm going to accept that as possible, but again, those are items that are dated, and I would be concerned about are those items going to be updated as processes are changed or evolved, but on principle it sounds like something that could potentially be acceptable. Mike Cox asks, this was focused on in ISO 9001, but as ISO moves standards to a more consistent mode, will these be applicable to other updated standards? Mike, to the very best of my knowledge, if it is a quality-based standard, it is required that you have an identification of what your processes are and how they interact with each other. Audit program management, for what it's worth, is mandatory from ISO 17021, and that applies to all quality-based standards. Anne-Marie Martinez, this IOP should represent the scope of the system and not all of the activities in our company unless those other departments offer a support role. And I suppose I understand, at least in part, where you're coming from. Perhaps you're thinking of accounting and things of this nature. Yes, to the extent that you're asking, it is intended to be a representation of your quality management system. I would find it difficult to accept that there's going to be that much of your company that does not participate in the quality system, though, and that's going to be exempt from the requirements of the standard. Robert Brown asks, is it assumed that the inputs and outputs of the processes are either documented by a procedure or by records resulting from the process? Robert, again, procedures are not required, at least not in ISO 9001. Records most assuredly are required in a number of places, but the manner of those records and how they're kept and how they're created, there's a lot of leeway. For example, inspection records, training records, and so forth. So is it assumed that they're going to be in a procedure? No. And is it assumed that we can look at your records and come to some conclusion on what your processes are? No. We still need to have a firm statement of what your processes are and how they interact with each other. Ramin Madavi, I do hope I'm pronouncing that right. Can we separate processes as management, support, main, and analysis? Potentially. If it's helpful to your quality system to have a classification of the process types, that certainly strikes me as acceptable. I'd be curious what would fall under management and what would fall under what would fall under support and what would fall under analysis, how you would separate those two. But yes, in principle, that sounds acceptable. Ana Gomez asks, is it a requirement to have a matrix with all of the responsibilities of each process, or how can we demonstrate the responsibilities of each process? The answer to your first question is no. It is not required to have a responsibility matrix. It is required in ISO 9001:2015 to define competency requirements, and you're also expected to have something in place for meeting the organizational knowledge requirements, which is going to be typically cross-training and things like this. In terms of demonstrating the responsibility for each process, there's a number of ways that can be done. You can accomplish that through procedures if you choose to have them, through work instructions if you choose to have them, through a responsibility matrix, I suppose, if you choose to have that, and so forth. Sharif Ahab, I do hope I'm pronouncing that right. We have 5 plants, each plant with different production process. Is it mandatory to make a different IOP for each plant? Sharif, assuming that it's a unified quality management system, I would opine that your production process would be considered a single process, and presumably you're controlling those production processes in a unified manner. In terms of what are the processes of the system, production would be a single process. That's at least the presumption that I would have. Kimberly Moore, is a process map the same as an IOP? Maybe. Again, remember, what we're looking for is what are your processes and how do they interact with each other. I'm not looking for something that tells me what is step 1 of your production process right through to step 20. That is not an IOP. That's a flow chart telling me what your production process is. Lindsay Jane, do we need to maintain metrics for each of the defined processes? Lindsay, you're required to have measures of effectiveness for your processes. Yes, they do not have to be individualized metrics for each of your processes. Melissa Henderson, so we don't have to have procedures and processes. Melissa, in ISO 9001:2015, you are not required to have procedures. No. You are required to have something that establishes what your processes are and how they interact with each other. Sharif asks, we are implementing SAP. Do we need to make an IOP for the SAP process? Well, again, Sharif, remember that it's not an individual IOP for just SAP. SAP is an ERP system for controlling aspects of your quality system. I don't believe that you would approach that as a standalone process. Florence Bernard, document identification for process such as doc control. Florence, I think you're asking me, do you have to have a standalone process for document control? You have to have a process for controlling your documents. In terms of how that's reflected on your IOP, it could certainly fall under support activities. Carolina Nunez, how do you audit the core versus support processes if work instructions are not required? Great question. To be very honest with you, I do not make a habit of auditing procedures because even in ISO 9001:2008, there were only 6 of them that were required in the first place. A long time ago, I got into the habit of auditing a process by interviewing the people doing the process and then looking at the records from that process. And as long as the records and the people were telling me the same thing, I was satisfied that the process was effective. And I would encourage you to take a similar viewpoint. Kimberly Moore asks, for the IATF standard, are you required to have a quality manual? That is an affirmative. You are absolutely required to have a quality manual for IATF 16949. I'm afraid I don't have a clause number to give you just this second. Oh, hold the phone, I do. Clause 7.5.1.1. That's on page 26 of the IATF standard. Again, that's clause 7.5.1.1. Chris Sweat asks, do you define accounting as it relates to the system, or have you seen this done? Yes and no. I have seen accounting defined as a contributor to the quality system. Frankly, I don't see how it couldn't be. Accounting typically is going to be invoicing customers. They're going to be responsible for approving budgets and things of this nature. I don't know how you leave accounting out, but do I go and actively audit the accounting activity, digging into the ledgers and so forth? No, I certainly do not. So it is common for companies to leave accounting out of the equation when they are looking at their quality system. Phyllis Palacios, my company has various certifications that interface. Should I show a process block and identify that it is covered under a different certification such as CMMI? Phyllis, this would probably be an item that would be best addressed offline. That's a very deep question. I do want to try to help you. Tell you what, if you want to reach out to me here at PJR headquarters, we'll discuss that offline. That's a very in-depth question. Robert Brown, during our most recent audit, the auditor indicated inputs and outputs were not clearly identified. The examples shown imply inputs and outputs. Is it correct to assume an IOP that illustrates the processes and how they are connected is sufficient? Robert, all of the examples given in today's presentation are from current or formerly certified PJR clients, with the exception of the model that we built up. If your IOP was rejected in the audit process and you believe it to be acceptable, please reach out to us here at PJR headquarters and we'll be glad to provide a third opinion and try to mediate that situation. Anna Maria Martinez, if there are no required procedures for ISO 9001:2015, how is an audit performed against practice? Okay, so we got you covered there, Anna Maria. Sharif Ahab, we have some in-process inspection which is not documented in inspection records. Is it considered a non-conformance? Well, Sharif, that's a little bit off topic. I would want to examine that on site to see how that squares with the requirements of the standard. It is required that inspection and approval of product be on the record. I'm not comfortable giving a firm opinion on that in this particular context. Okay. Okay. Shelley Tutt asks a question pertaining to AS 9100. Shelley, I'm going to have to ask that you reach out to a member of our AS 9100 Executive Committee. If you call the PJR 1-800 number, they'll definitely be able to help you with that. And Carolina Nunez asks, do we offer help on updates to ISO 9001:2015? We do have a webinar on that very topic. We have a new webinar actually that'll be premiering next month, so please do check the website for the date and time. Okay, well, as usual, we've had great questions from our participants. I do want to wish all of you a great day. Thank you.